Have you ever been so infuriated by a homeowners association that you just wanted to buy the whole damn lake they were fining you over? It sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't it? Well, I actually did it. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and this is the story of how one ridiculous fishing fine led to me owning what I now affectionately call Arthur's Pond, and in the process, teaching a power-tripping HOA president a lesson he'd never, ever forget. Stick around to hear all the infuriating and ultimately satisfying details. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to know. And more importantly, let me know in the comments if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that made your blood boil, because I have a feeling I'm not alone in this. My journey into the hornet's nest that was the Lakeside Serenity Homeowners Association began with the quiet hope of a peaceful retirement. After a long career as a corporate lawyer, a field that demanded much and often gave back in stress what it offered in remuneration, all I craved was stillness. My dear Eleanor, my wife of 47 years, had passed 2 years prior, and the large house we'd shared felt hollow, echoing with her absence. She had always loved the water, the gentle lapping of waves, the meditative patience of fishing. So, when a small cottage came up for sale in Lakeside Serenity, a community built around a picturesque spring-fed lake, it felt like a sign. It had a little wooden dock at the edge of the modest backyard, and I could almost see Eleanor there, smiling, rod in hand. I bought it, moved in with a few cherished belongings, and looked forward to quiet days, good books, and the simple pleasure of casting a line into the water. I didn't advertise my past profession, nor the comfortable nest egg I'd accumulated through diligent work and prudent investments. I was just Arthur, the retiree, looking for a bit of solace. The architect of my eventual discontent and the self-proclaimed king of Lakeside Serenity was one Reginald Thorne. He was the HOA president, a man whose sense of self-importance seemed to expand in direct proportion to the pettiness of the domain he ruled. Thorne was a caricature of a minor potentate, a florid complexion, a voice that boomed with unearned authority, and a penchant for driving around the neighborhood in a golf cart adorned with a ludicrously oversized orange flag, as if he were leading a charge. His board members were a collection of either timid sycophants or equally officious individuals who seemed to revel in the minutiae of rule enforcement. Their newsletters, delivered with ominous frequency, were filled with dire warnings about the precise permissible shade of beige for exterior paint and the catastrophic consequences of placing one's recycling bin an inch too far from the curb. I'd read them with a sigh, filed them away, and mostly ignored them, content in my quiet corner. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the fuse of my dormant legal mind, occurred on a Tuesday morning, crisp and clear. I was on my small dock, the sun warm on my face, a gentle breeze ruffling the surface of the lake. I just cast my line, the lure making a satisfying plink as it hit the water. It was the epitome of the peace I'd sought. Suddenly, the whir of an electric motor announced Thorne's arrival. He pulled up on the grass verge of my property, his golf cart somehow managing to look both menacing and absurd. "Mr. Jenkins, I presume," he boomed, not waiting for a confirmation. His eyes, small and assessing, flicked from me to my fishing rod and back. "Yes, that's me," I replied politely, reeling in my line slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." It was a good morning, he said, his tone suggesting I had personally ruined it, until I observed this blatant violation of Lakeside Serenity bylaws. Section 7, subsection C, paragraph 4. All recreational activities on or within the confines of Lake Serenity, including but not limited to fishing, boating, and swimming, require a Class A recreational permit issued exclusively by the Lakeside Serenity HOA Board. He puffed out his chest. "I don't recall seeing an application from you, Mr. Jenkins, nor would one likely be approved for a newcomer so quickly. These permits are typically reserved for established residents who have demonstrated a commitment to our community standards." I frowned slightly. A permit? To fish from my own property? The lake abuts my land. I'd read the thick binder of CC and RS and bylaws before purchasing, a habit ingrained from decades of contract review, but I didn't recall anything quite so restrictive about fishing from one's own land, especially when the marketing material for the community had heavily featured the lake as an amenity. Thorne smirked, a thoroughly unpleasant expression. Your property line, Mr. Jenkins, ends at the waterline. The lake itself is a community asset governed by the HOA for the benefit of all residents, not for the unregulated exploitation by a few. His voice dripped with condescension. Ignorance of the bylaws is no excuse. You'll receive a formal notification of the infraction and the associated fine. I suggest you familiarize yourself with our rules. We value tranquility and order here. He then spun his golf cart around with a flourish and sped off, leaving me standing there, not with the peace I'd been enjoying, but with a familiar cold anger beginning to uncoil in my gut. A few days later, the formal notification arrived, a fine of $500 for unauthorized recreational activity and environmental disturbance. For a single hook and line. It was preposterous. It was extortion, and it was a challenge. My initial reaction was a mixture of disbelief and profound irritation. $500 was not going to break me, not by a long shot, but the sheer arrogance, the petty tyranny of it all, lit a fire under me. Eleanor's voice echoed in my memory, a gentle but firm admonishment she often used when I was tempted to let an injustice slide in my personal life. Don't let them walk all over you, Artie. Principle is principle. This wasn't about a fishing fine anymore. It was about the abuse of power, however small the kingdom. I retrieved the hefty binder of HOA documents, covenants, conditions and restrictions, bylaws, rules and regulations, minutes of past meetings going back 3 years. It was time to dust off skills I hadn't used for myself in a long time. I spread the documents across my dining room table, a fresh legal pad and a pot of coffee at my elbow. The language was dense, often circular, occasionally contradictory, typical of documents drafted by committees and amended piecemeal over years. But as I read, my mind, trained by decades of dissecting complex contracts and litigation briefs, began to sharpen. I wasn't just Arthur, the grieving retiree, anymore. I was Arthur Jenkins, Esquire, and Mr. Thorne had just inadvertently woken a sleeping dragon. I noted vague definitions, questionable procedures for rule changes, and an alarming concentration of discretionary power in the hands of the president and the Architectural Control Committee, which Thorne also chaired. He's built himself a little fiefdom, I thought, and fiefdoms often have weak foundations. The clause he cited regarding the fishing permit was indeed there, buried deep. But then I noticed something interesting. The bylaws frequently referred to HOA common property and community assets. The lake was consistently treated as such in their internal documents. But what if it wasn't? What if their assumed authority over the lake itself was built on sand? I made a note. Investigate precise ownership of Lake Serenity. My preliminary search of the publicly available county GIS mapping system showed the lake as a separate parcel, but the listed owner was a development company that had been dissolved over a decade ago. Interesting. Very interesting. This would require a deeper dive into the county records, something I was more than familiar with. My old briefcase, tucked away in a closet, seemed to call to me. Inside, my favorite fountain pen, a relic from a landmark case I'd won years ago, felt cool and familiar in my hand. All right, Thorne, I thought, a grim satisfaction settling in. Game on. My first step was to attend the next HOA meeting. I wanted to observe Thorne in his natural habitat, to gauge the support he had, and to identify potential allies, or at least fellow dissenters. The meeting was held in the small, sterile community clubhouse. Thorne presided from a slightly elevated table, gavel in hand, flanked by his board. He exuded an air of bored omnipotence, swatting down questions with dismissive remarks or drowning them in jargon. Most residents seemed cowed or resigned. A few, however, wore expressions of thinly veiled frustration. One was a woman in her late 30s, Sarah Miller, who raised a pointed question about a sudden increase in landscaping fees. Thorne brushed her off, saying, "These matters are best left to the board, Mrs. Miller. We have experts who handle these complex budgetary issues." Her jaw tightened, and she scribbled furiously in her notebook. Another was an elderly gentleman, Mr. Henderson, who listened intently, his brow furrowed. When the floor was opened for new business, a formality, it seemed, as Thorne usually declared there was none, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Reginald," he began, his voice surprisingly firm, "I recall when this community was founded, the spirit was one of cooperation, not endless rules and fines. The lake was meant to be a joy for everyone, not a revenue stream." Thorne's face darkened. "Times change, James. Order requires structure, and structure requires enforcement." He banged his gavel. Meeting adjourned. After the meeting, I approached Sarah Miller. "Excuse me, Mrs. Miller? Arthur Jenkins. I'm new here. I admired your tenacity with that landscaping question." She gave a wry smile. "Tenacity gets you nowhere with that lot. Just gets you on their list. I got fined last month because my garden gnome was, and I quote, of a non-conforming whimsical nature. Can you believe it?" "I can't actually," I said. "I was recently fined for fishing." Her eyes widened. "You're kidding. From your own dock?" "Apparently, it's a privilege, not a right," I said dryly. "I was wondering, do you know much about the history of the HOA's control over the lake?" "Not a lot," she admitted. "But if anyone does, it's Mr. Henderson. He was one of the first homeowners here. Practically a founding father. That led me to Mr. James Henderson. I found him tending his roses the next morning. He was a retired civil engineer, sharp and articulate, with a treasure trove of old documents and memories. "Thorne," he said, shaking his head as he snipped a dead bloom. "He came in about 10 years ago, full of bluster. Got himself elected president by promising to raise standards. What he raised was dues and his own ego." "Mr. Henderson," I began cautiously, "I've been looking into the ownership of the lake. The county records are a bit unclear. They list Lakeside Development Corp. as the owner, but that company was dissolved." His eyes lit up with a spark of interest. "Ah, now that's a very good question, Mr. Jenkins. Lakeside Development was Old Man Abernathy. He built this place. He always intended the lake to be a central feature, but he was cagey about who exactly owned it after the initial development phase. He passed away, and his estate was a mess. I always wondered if the HOA actually had clear title to it, or if they just sort of assumed control." He paused, then a slow smile spread across his face. "You know, I might have some old parcel maps and correspondence from Abernathy somewhere in the attic. Might make for interesting reading." This was gold. "I would be very grateful to see them, Mr. Henderson." He nodded. "Call me James, son, and I think we might have something to talk about." Over the next few weeks, James, Sarah, and I formed an unlikely but determined little triumvirate. We met discreetly, usually in my cottage or James's, poring over the documents James had unearthed from his attic. They were a goldmine. Amongst yellowed blueprints and faded letters, there was correspondence between Abernathy and his lawyers discussing the lake parcel. It was clear Abernathy had intended to either sell it as a separate commercial entity, perhaps for a small marina or recreational business that never materialized, or transfer it to a specially formed lake trust, but neither had happened before his death. Critically, there was no deed explicitly transferring ownership of the lakebed or riparian rights to the Lakeside Serenity HOA. They had, as James suspected, simply acted as if they owned it, and no one had challenged them. "They're squatters, in a legal sense, regarding the lake's governance," I mused, tapping a crucial letter. "They might have grounds for claiming some prescriptive easement for access based on historical use, but outright ownership and the right to charge permit fees? Highly doubtful." Sarah, meanwhile, put her tech skills to use. She was an accountant before becoming a stay-at-home mom, and she had a knack for sniffing out financial discrepancies. With James's historical knowledge of past budgets and my guidance on what to look for in terms of potential conflicts of interest or misuse of funds, she began a forensic examination of the HOA's publicly available financial statements and meeting minutes where budgets were approved. "Look at this," she said one evening, pointing her laptop screen. "The landscaping contract. It's been with Thorne's premier groundskeeping for the last 5 years. The fees have increased by 60% in that time, way above inflation. And guess who owns Thorne's premier groundskeeping, according to state business filings? Let me guess, I said. A relative of our esteemed president. His brother-in-law, Sarah confirmed, a grim satisfaction in her voice. And there are these consulting fees paid out to a company with no clear deliverables registered to a P.O. box. The amounts aren't huge individually, but they add up. The picture was becoming clearer. Thorne was not just a petty tyrant. He was likely a corrupt one, using the HOA as his personal piggy bank, all while terrorizing residents over garden gnomes and fishing rods. Thorne, however, wasn't idle. Perhaps sensing a shift in the air, or just emboldened by his perceived authority, he escalated his own activities. I received another notice, this time a warning for improper storage of fishing tackle, because my favorite casting rod had been leaning against the side of my porch for an afternoon. At the next HOA board meeting, which I dutifully attended, Thorne delivered a particularly smug speech about certain individuals who sought to undermine the harmony and high standards of lakeside serenity. He announced a proposal for a new lake enhancement special assessment, a hefty one-time fee per household, ostensibly for dredging and new aquatic plantings. This lake is the jewel of our community, he declared, his gaze sweeping the room and lingering, I thought, a moment too long on me. And we must all contribute to its preservation and, indeed, its improvement under the careful stewardship of your HOA. The irony was almost painful. He wanted us to pay for enhancing a jewel he didn't even own. Oh, Reginald, I thought, you're making this far too easy. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time for a plan. A rather audacious one, perhaps, but the situation called for a definitive stroke. My legal mind, now fully engaged, saw the cleanest path. If the HOA's power over the lake stemmed from their assumed ownership, then the most effective way to neutralize that power was to establish actual ownership. My ownership. The first step was tracing the current legal status of the original Lakeside Development Corp. And its assets. It took some old-fashioned legal legwork, delving into probate records for Abernathy's estate, and then tracking down the trustees of the residual assets of the dissolved corporation. It turned out the lake parcel was still technically held by a trust administered by a sleepy law firm in another state, an asset largely forgotten and considered more of a liability due to potential property taxes, which I discovered the HOA had been paying, further muddying the waters of perceived ownership but not establishing title. I contacted the trustees, not as Arthur Jenkins, Lakeside Serenity resident, but through a newly formed limited liability company, Clearwater Holdings LLC, with myself as the sole anonymous member. My offer for the lake parcel was modest but fair, considering its encumbered and neglected state. To them, it was a chance to offload a problematic asset. After some negotiation, conducted through my old law firm acting as intermediary to maintain my anonymity, we struck a deal. The paperwork was drawn up, due diligence completed with the speed and precision of my former professional life, and the funds transferred from my investment accounts. One sunny afternoon, my lawyer called. Arthur, he said, the deed for parcel R47, otherwise known as Lake Serenity, was recorded in the county clerk's office at 3:15 p.m. today. Clearwater Holdings LLC is now the proud owner. Congratulations, you own a lake. A slow smile spread across my face. I looked out at the water, shimmering in the afternoon light. My lake. The thought was immensely satisfying. Meanwhile, Thorne, blissfully unaware of the tectonic shift beneath his feet, was pushing hard for his lake enhancement special assessment. He'd called a special HOA meeting to vote on it, confident he could railroad it through. The notices for the meeting went out, full of dire warnings about the lake falling into disrepair if the assessment wasn't approved. The stakes were certainly rising. Thorne, in his zeal, had also started to target my allies more directly. Sarah received a violation notice for operating a business from home, her supposed crime being the occasional package delivery related to an online course she was taking. James was cited for the paint on his mailbox being a non-approved shade of black, a mailbox that hadn't been repainted in 20 years. It was petty, vindictive, and designed to intimidate. He's getting desperate or overconfident, I thought. Either way, he's walking right into it. I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the kind I used to get before a major court battle. This wasn't just about a fishing fine anymore. It was about restoring sanity and decency to this small community. And perhaps, in a way, it was for Eleanor too. She had always championed the underdog. The evening of the special HOA meeting arrived, thick with anticipation. The community clubhouse was packed, more residents than I'd ever seen at a meeting before. Thorne's proposed special assessment had clearly touched a nerve. He sat at the head table, looking particularly smug, flanked by his stone-faced board members. He clearly expected a swift victory. He opened the meeting with his usual pomposity, launching into a lengthy diatribe about the critical importance of the Lake Enhancement Special Assessment. This jewel of lakeside serenity, our beautiful lake, he pontificated, gesturing grandly towards the windows that overlooked the dark water, requires our urgent attention. It requires significant investment to maintain its ecological balance, its aesthetic appeal, and ultimately, our property values. Your HOA board has worked tirelessly to develop a comprehensive plan, and this modest assessment is essential for its implementation. He droned on about dredging, aeration systems, and strategically placed decorative fountains. I listened patiently, holding a simple manila folder in my lap. Finally, he called for a motion to approve the assessment. One of his board members dutifully made the motion. Another seconded it. "Is there any discussion?" Thorne asked, his tone daring anyone to object. This was my cue. I stood up slowly. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to me, the quiet newcomer who had dared to question the fishing regulations. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice calm but carrying easily in the suddenly silent room. "Before we vote on an assessment to enhance the lake, perhaps we should clarify a fundamental point. Specifically, the HOA's authority to levy such an assessment for this particular purpose." Thorne visibly bristled. "Mr. Jenkins, the HOA's authority is well established. We are responsible for all common areas, and a lake is the primary common asset of this community." "Is it, though?" I asked, my tone still mild. "You see, I've done a little research into the ownership of the lake parcel, and it appears the Lakeside Serenity Homeowners Association does not, in fact, hold title to Lake Serenity." A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne's face began to redden. "That is preposterous. Absolute nonsense. This HOA has governed that lake, maintained it, and regulated its use for over 20 years. Governing without clear legal ownership can be a precarious position, Mr. Thorne," I continued, opening the manila folder. "And while the HOA may have acted as custodian and even paid property taxes on it, that doesn't confer title. In fact, as of last Tuesday, at precisely 3:15 p.m., the deed for parcel LR 47, commonly known as Lake Serenity, was officially transferred and recorded. Clearwater Holdings LLC is the new registered owner." I paused for effect. "And I am the sole managing member of Clearwater Holdings LLC. In simpler terms, Mr. Thorne, I own the lake." I placed a certified copy of the deed on the table in front of me. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound you could hear a pin drop. Then came the gasps. Thorne's jaw literally dropped. His florid complexion went from red to a ghastly, mottled white, then back to an apoplectic purple. You can't," he finally sputtered, his voice a strangled squawk. This is an outrage. A trick. It's a matter of public record, Mr. Thorne," I said calmly. "And as the new owner of the lake, I'm thinking of renaming it Arthur's Pond. I rather like the sound of that. I've decided on a few new rules regarding its use the residents are now leaning forward, hanging on every word. Firstly, fishing from one's own property, or indeed anywhere on the lake by invitation of the owner, is perfectly acceptable. No permits required from me. Secondly, and more pertinent to this evening's discussion and the general community, effective immediately, all access to the lake and its shoreline from any property other than my own is hereby prohibited without my express written consent. I'll be having no trespassing private property signs installed along the entire perimeter tomorrow morning. I let that sink in. This prohibition includes any and all so-called HOA common areas that abut my lake, as any encroachment onto the lakebed or the shoreline up to the historical high water mark, as clearly defined in this recent survey. I produced another document. Will be considered trespassing. Thorne was on his feet now, trembling with rage. You wouldn't dare. This community relies on that lake. The views, the access. This will destroy property values. I'll sue you. I'll sue the HOA. I'll. He seemed to deflate, words failing him. A wave of worried murmurs swept through the residence. Some looked panicked, others furious, but their fury was now tinged with uncertainty, no longer solely directed at me. You certainly have the right to pursue legal action, Mr. Thorne, I acknowledged. Though on what grounds, I'm not entirely sure, since one generally cannot sue for being denied access to property they don't own. However, while we're on the subject of potential legal entanglements and the proper use of community funds, I turned slightly to address the wider audience. Perhaps this would also be an opportune moment to discuss certain financial irregularities that Mrs. Sarah Miller has recently uncovered in the HOA's accounting. Specifically, regarding the rather lucrative landscaping contract awarded to Thorne's Premier Groundskeeping, a company beneficially owned by President Thorne's brother-in-law, and a series of questionable consulting fees paid to an entity with no discernible services rendered. Sarah, looking nervous but resolute, stood up and distributed a concise, one-page summary of her findings to the board members and the nearest residents, who quickly began passing them around. The atmosphere in the room, already electric, crackled with a new, dangerous energy, an energy now squarely aimed at Reginald Thorne. His desperate attempt to regain control by blustering about legal action against me had completely backfired, his face a mask of dawning horror as he realized the full extent of his predicament. The hunter had just become the hunted, and the trap I'd laid had snapped shut with satisfying precision. The impact of the dual revelations, my ownership of the lake and Sarah's preliminary findings of financial impropriety, was instantaneous and devastating for Thorne. The worried murmurs from residents quickly turned into angry shouts. He sold us out, one man yelled, brandishing Sarah's summary. All that money for his family, a woman cried, her voice filled with betrayal. While he's fining us for the color of our petunias. Mr. Henderson rose, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the rising chaos. Reginald, he said, his voice cutting through the din, I believe your position as president of this homeowners association is no longer tenable. For the good of the community, I ask for your immediate resignation. Resign. Resign. The chant started, low at first, then swelling to a roar. Thorne looked around wildly, his eyes darting from face to face, seeking an ally, a friendly glance, but finding only accusation and contempt. His board members, who had moments before been his staunchest supporters, now conspicuously avoided his gaze, inching their chairs away from him as if he were contagious. One of them, a mousy woman named Mrs. Perkins who usually just nodded along, found her voice. Reginald, I think James is right. Perhaps it's best. Thorne deflated like a punctured balloon. The fight went out of him. He mumbled something incoherent, then grabbed his gavel, not to bring order, but as if it were a drowning man's straw. He threw it down on the table with a clatter. Fine, he choked out. Fine. He then turned and practically fled the clubhouse, the jeers and angry shouts of the residents following him out into the night. The immediate consequence for Thorne was a complete and utter loss of power and face. An emergency vote was held on the spot, and an interim committee was formed with Mr. Henderson, Sarah Miller, and a couple of other respected, level-headed residents at its helm. Their first act was to formally suspend all fines issued by Thorne in the past 6 months, pending review, and to commission a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances. My own $500 fishing fine was, of course, instantly and gleefully nullified. The Lake Enhancement Special Assessment was dead on arrival. I had achieved my initial, rather personal goal. I could fish in peace from my own dock without harassment. But more than that, a palpable sense of relief and vindication filled the clubhouse. People were talking excitedly, some laughing, others already discussing how to rebuild. Many came up to shake my hand, to thank me. I wasn't a hero, I told them, just a man who valued his peace and quiet, and who happened to have the means and the background to push back effectively when pushed too far. But it felt good, nonetheless, to see the cloud of Thorne's petty tyranny lift from lakeside serenity. The immediate satisfaction was immense, like a weight removed, not just from my shoulders, but from the entire community. In the weeks and months that followed, Lakeside Serenity underwent a profound transformation. The forensic audit, as expected, uncovered a pattern of mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and outright embezzlement by Thorne. The amounts weren't vast, not compared to the corporate fraud I'd seen in my career, but for a small HOA, they were significant enough to warrant legal action. The reformed HOA board, under the steady guidance of James Henderson and the sharp oversight of Sarah Miller, pursued a civil case against Thorne to recover the misappropriated funds. Criminal charges were also filed by the district attorney based on the audit's findings. Thorne's downfall was complete and public. His house went up for sale shortly thereafter, a distress sale, I heard, and he and his wife moved away, leaving Lakeside Serenity to heal. The HOA itself was rebuilt from the ground up. New bylaws were drafted, emphasizing transparency, resident participation, and sensible, community-focused governance. The endless stream of nitpicking violation notices ceased. The atmosphere in the neighborhood lightened considerably. People started talking to each other more, an air of cautious optimism replacing the previous climate of suspicion and resentment. As for Arthur's Pond, well, for a while, I kept the no trespassing signs up, not out of malice, but to let the lesson sink in, that assumptions of right and privilege without legal foundation are dangerous things. It also gave the new HOA board the breathing room to establish their own credibility and to focus on internal reforms without the distraction of lake management. The community learned to respect boundaries, literally. Eventually, once the new HOA was firmly established and had proven its commitment to fairness and transparency, I approached them. I had no desire to be a lake baron. I proposed the creation of the Lake Serenity Stewardship Trust, funded initially by me, with a board composed of myself, a representative from the HOA, and an independent ecologist. The trust would manage the lake for conservation and responsible recreational use by the residents of Lakeside Serenity. Access would be granted via a formal, legally sound agreement with the HOA for a nominal annual fee per household that would go directly into the trust for maintenance, ecological projects, and perhaps even a small fishing dock for community use on a section of the shore I designated. The key was that the rules would be clear, fair, and administered by a body focused on the lake's well-being, not on power trips. The HOA readily agreed. I found my peace, not just in the solitude of fishing, but in the quiet satisfaction of having used my old skills to right a wrong, and, in doing so, helped the community rediscover its sense of fairness. Eleanor would have approved. She always said that the most satisfying victories were not the ones that brought personal gain, but those that restored balance and dignity. I still fish from my dock, the waters of Arthur's Pond calm and inviting. The fish weren't always biting, but that didn't matter. The tranquility was reward enough. So, Reginald Thorne was out, disgraced and facing the legal consequences of his greed and arrogance. The Lakeside Serenity HOA was reformed, a testament to what can happen when residents decide they've had enough. And Arthur's Pond, now managed by the Stewardship Trust, became a symbol not of exclusion, but of what happens when you push a quiet man too far, and he decides to push back with everything he's got. Justice in this instance was not only served cold, but was also meticulously planned, legally executed, and yes, bought and paid for. The thematic takeaway here, I suppose, is multifaceted. It's a story about the insidious nature of petty tyranny and how unchecked power, even on a small scale, can corrupt. It's about the importance of due diligence, of understanding your rights, and of not being afraid to challenge bullies, even if they wear the guise of authority. And perhaps, Most satisfyingly, it's about the profound empowerment that comes from turning the tables, using an antagonist's own overconfidence and underestimation against them. Sometimes the most effective way to deal with someone who thinks they control the playground is to, well, buy the playground. Remember to always read the fine print, folks, and never underestimate the quiet ones. They might just have a few tricks up their sleeve, or in my case, a well-funded LLC and a deep understanding of property law. What did you think of Thorne's rather dramatic exit from Lakeside Serenity? Let me know your final thoughts in the comments below. And for Eleanor, who always believed in fighting the good fight, even in retirement, and who always knew I had a bit more fire in me than I let on, this one, my dear, was definitely for you. Thanks for watching.